Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series. This is not a series on postmodernism. In this video, we're going to be looking at what is postmodern philosophy of language. Now, the tools of postmodernism have on occasion been turned upon philosophy itself. Well, this has been done in many ways. In these next three videos, we're going to be looking at postmodern critiques of meaning, truth, and logic and reason. For each of these, we're going to look at philosophers from both the analytic and Continental tradition who approach the same issue but from different directions or through different lenses. This first video is going to focus on language and meaning, and we'll look at the works of Wittgenstein and Derrida. Now, we're not going to cover these philosophers systematically and cover everything that they're talking about. Rather, we're going to look at very specific elements of their philosophy that apply to postmodernism. That, let's take a look. Now, first we take a linguistic turn towards postmodernism in the philosophy of language. The analytic philosopher most strongly associated with postmodern critiques of meaning is Ludwig Wittgenstein, specifically later Wittgenstein's language games, which are often referenced by even Continental postmodernists as a challenge to absolute or objective conceptions of the meaning of words. So the big question that we're looking at here is there an objective meaning of a given word outside of kind of a context or a presentation that we're looking at, or a language game, as we'll see. Wittgenstein challenged this arguably modernist notion that words have objective meanings outside of the context that they are used in. Now, Wittgenstein claimed that language was actually a set of games that followed particular rules. Meanings of words are dependent on their use and the language games that they are being used in. In other words, given different contexts, a single word may have different uses and therefore mean different things. Even a phrase or an entire article or book may mean different things in different contexts. Language games include things like telling a joke, making up a story, or making up and testing a hypothesis. What determines the rules of these games and the use of these words is a common shared experience. Grammar, therefore, is not an external system of rules, but rather a shared set of norms and agreements about how we play that language game. And we might suspend grammar in certain situations, such as a tweet, while enforce it strictly in things like an academic paper. Understanding what someone is saying requires an understanding of the language game that they are playing. We do different things in a joke than we would if we are stating our case or making a claim. And words do not have objective meaning outside of these games because their meaning will be different depending on the game that's being played. Wittgenstein preferred the concept of family resemblance between words when offering definitions compared to the commonly used necessary and sufficient conditions for a word or an idea being satisfied. Now, that was fairly abstract, so let's take a look at a specific thought experiment that Wittgenstein famously uses, which will help understand what this means. So, the idea that a meaning of a word is dependent on the shared use is exemplified by Wittgenstein's Beetle thought experiment. So, imagine that everyone has a box with something inside. There are all sorts of different things inside their boxes, and people don't tell anyone else what's inside their box. Rather, they refer to the thing that is inside their box as a beetle. So my beetle is whatever is inside my box. It could be a pencil, it could be a tea bag, it could be whatever. The meaning of the word beetle, then, is not dependent on what is in any given person's box. Beetle doesn't mean something different if I have a miniature Statue of Liberty in my box, but rather the shared use of the word. In fact, beetle means the thing that the person has in their box, not anything about what is in that box. Words are given meaning by their use and by the way that we use them in common parlance and language, as opposed to the thing that they refer to. The postmodernist themes running through this should be very clear. If a word doesn't have objective meaning based on the thing that it refers to, but rather is given meaning by the particular language game that it's being played, we cannot interpret the truth of a statement outside of a context or outside of a language game. For example, the statement, "get out of here," could be an instruction to someone, an expression of surprise or astonishment, or an expression of hatred or contempt, or even the punchline to a joke. It depends on the tone of voice, "get out of here" versus "get out of here." The meaning is not in the words, but it's dependent on the language game that's being played by the speaker and the listener. There's not one right language game for a phrase. There's not one correct meaning of "get out of here" without a context. So we can't evaluate the objective truth of that phrase, only its truth within the rules of a given language game. So, hopefully that gives you a sense of Wittgenstein. We're going to move on to Derrida, but there's a lot of connections that we'll see between them, and in the end we'll kind of wrap up and show how these play across all of postmodernism. So, Continental philosopher Jacques Derrida also expresses what has been considered postmodern skepticism about meaning in language. So, before we get into this, we need to look at a bit of Derrida's project. So Derrida documents a preference for the spoken word over the written word throughout philosophy, notably in Plato and Husserl, but in other places as well. For these philosophers, the spoken word is a signifier for the ideal, the true meaning, the signified, the referent out there in the world, whereas the written word is simply a signifier of the spoken word, which in turn is a signifier of that real true thing out there. And if you have read Plato or understand Plato's idea of the forms and why Plato doesn't like poetry, check out my video on that, you'll understand that the further away we get from that true form, the less accurate or the less we have a preference for something. And so we want something as close to that true form as possible. And so the spoken word is preferable to the written word. The spoken word can't be taken out of context in the same way the written word can, as it disappears as soon as it is said. And so, one might make the case that because of this, you can't have a different language game being played with it, or you would understand the language game someone's playing with a spoken word that you might not understand with the written word. The written word, on the other hand, is a signifier of a signifier, a representation of the spoken word. In some ways, a hyperreal simulacrum, and therefore writing signifies the spoken word, which in turn signifies the ideal, which means it's further from the ideal than preferable. The written word can be more easily taken out of context, as it's likely to survive the death of the author. Due to this, the spoken word is primary in its connection to meaning for many philosophers. However, Derrida is going to challenge this. He argues that all signifiers, whether they're spoken or written, refer to other signifiers for their meaning. We explain what a word means by using other words. If all words are simply signifiers for other signifiers, then all languages suffer from the same issues that writing does. They are simply signifiers of other signifiers. Language is nothing but an endless chain of signifiers that never reach a referent, that never reach that pure form. Words can be taken out of context and used in a different language game to mean something else, regardless of if they're written or spoken. There's not one objective meaning to a given text that's sufficiently complicated, because the language game of the reader and the language game of the author may be so different as to change completely the intended meaning of the text. Because what those words are referring to is not some object out there in the world, but rather a set of other signifiers that are held within our own understanding of how to interpret text, our own language game of how we should be interpreting that text. And so the way I interpret a particular word, because of my background, experiences, and memories, may be completely different from how you interpret that same word. Derrida went on to challenge the official interpretations of text, showing that an individual text can be interpreted radically differently, and there is no objective method to determine what a text actually means. The method he used is often referred to here as deconstruction. Derrida goes so far as to argue that a given text doesn't even have an author, but rather the author's name is yet another signifier, which fails to connect directly to a referent, but rather connects to a chain of other signifiers. For example, when you speak of Plato, you've never met Plato, your word doesn't actually succeed in referring to that individual. Rather, it refers to other signifiers. It refers to your understanding of Plato, things that you believe about Plato to be true. It refers to all of those other words. It refers to those connections and those ideas. It doesn't succeed in referring to a physical object out there in the world. Rather, it refers to those descriptions that you learned when you learned about Plato. When someone teaches you about Plato, they don't go and dig up his grave and point and say Plato. They tell you things. They use words. Your idea of even an individual referred to out in the world is simply referencing a chain of other signifiers, not some physical signified out there in the world. For Derrida, there's no grounding in a master signifier that points to the real object, just more signs and descriptions based on other signs and descriptions. And therefore, when you are saying things, how you're interpreting something and how someone else is interpreting something is there's not an objective way for you to interpret a particular phrase, because the language game, the experiences, the other signifiers that you use around that signifier may be different than what the other person is doing. So the privileging of speech over writing is not the only hierarchical dichotomy Derrida took issue with. Rather, he identified many dichotomies within the history of philosophy: body and mind, truth and error, intelligible, sensible, speech, writing, etc., as did other post-structuralists. Derrida made the case that there was an unjustified marginalization of one side of each of these dichotomies in philosophy, and that that marginalization was used to understand and interpret those texts, but that marginalization was not justified and was simply a fact of convention, and that we could understand texts differently if we valorize the other side. So Derrida made the case that these unjustified marginalizations, like mind over body, truth over error, speech over writing, were problematic and were simply a fact of convention, not a fact of any justifiable objective truth of the world. But that also these dichotomies were required for understanding texts. So Derrida's deconstruction then was the process of identifying these implicit hierarchies, going out and supporting the marginalized portion to be on equal ground, treating truth as equal to error, treating body as equal to mind, etc., and then demonstrating that this would change the meaning of a text and that the hierarchy was arbitrary. In other words, if we were coming to a text with a different cultural understanding of what is good and what is bad, what is valorized and what is marginalized, we would take a different meaning from that text. And so individual words would have different meanings. According to Derrida, deconstruction is a process of demonstrating that narrative literary texts did not have a fixed meaning, because our interpretation of them was based on an implicit understanding of a valorized hierarchy, which, if discarded, would change the meaning. In other words, the sentence, "Colin found that he was in error," might have a negative connotation given our implicit valorization of error as a bad thing. But if we discard this hierarchy, or if we bring up the other side of support the marginalized side of the hierarchy, of the dichotomy, we find a new emotional meaning in the sentence. Colin found he was in error may have a negative connotation for us now, but if you said maybe error isn't a bad thing, why are we making that underlying assumption that's in some way unjustified? Colin being in error may not be a bad thing, and so our interpretation of the statement, Colin is in error, as negative, may be unjustified. And there may be different meanings to these texts. So, Derrida is making the case that both language doesn't succeed at referring to things, but rather it's referring to a set of an endless chain of signifiers, and that within that kind of endless chain of signifiers, within that language game, within that meta-narrative, to a certain degree, you have assumptions that are unjustified, and if were we to assume the opposite, the meaning of statements and the meaning of language would change. So some have taken this view farther, looking at the cultural implications of this implicit valorization of one opposite over the other. Why does a culture value masculinity over femininity, whiteness over blackness, efficiency over relationships? One possible answer is that we're underdetermined to which opposite to value, but a culture in power leads us to value that which is most beneficial for preserving that status quo. We'll see more of kind of these post-structuralist dichotomies with Foucault's critique of reason, but you should also check out our video on what is racism for more on this. The kind of seventh type of racism we look at looks at some of these questions around kind of cultural valuations of certain ideas over others and these implicit hierarchies. So, these arguments about meaning are connected to postmodernism, as they doubt the modernist conception that sentences have objective meanings. When I say a particular sentence, there is some objective meaning out in the world. There's something that it's referring to, it's succeeding at referring, and you can judge that sentence as true or false without any other information. In the same way that postmodernists about aesthetics argue that pieces of art don't have an objective meaning outside of their context, postmodernism about meaning argues that individual sentences lack objective meaning and can change their meaning depending on the rules of a language game, of the language game that's being played. So if you are playing one language game, your sentence may mean one thing. If you're playing a different language game, your sentence may mean something else. And it does seem that the sentence, "he had it coming," has a different meaning when it's used in the context of a police interrogation, a punchline of a joke, or a description of a dream, or even when it's sung in a musical. Context matters for meaning. This challenges the meta-narrative of progressive knowledge accumulation, since the statements that we know can change meaning depending on the context they're presented in. So, despite Derrida's aversion to quote-unquote isms, his endless chain of signifiers seems also to match the idea of simulacra. Signifiers that fail to actually refer to real objects, but rather refer to other representations. Texts failing to have objective meaning, but rather having meaning only based on how the audience interprets them, based on the audience's understanding and connections with those particular words, fits with both the idea of paradigms and the aesthetic principle that the artist no longer determines the true meaning of a piece of art, because for Derrida there isn't really an artist that corresponds to the name attached to that piece of art, just more signifiers and simulacra. Much of the meanings of texts requires us to assume hierarchies of dichotomies. When we deconstruct these hierarchies, the meaning of the text becomes underdetermined, or we can find different interpretations for it. And so, by deconstructing these hierarchies, our own meta-narratives and cultural backgrounds, we can see that the only reason we're interpreting something a certain way is because that is our background and those are the implicit assumptions we have, and those implicit assumptions may be inaccurate or not based on facts. This also has connection to the breaking of the distinction between popular art and high art. Semantics is not top-down for the postmodernist. Meaning comes from common usage, not from the ivory tower. Academia does not objectively define what words mean. Most often, they observe the uses of new phrases like glow up, period, or yeet, and try to explain their use. The public use of words is what gives them meaning. That use may be informed by the definition handed down from academia for words like Mach-Zehnder, interferometer, but if those words developed a different use, they would mean something different. The meaning of words is dependent on their use in particular contexts, and divorced from those contexts, those words lack a meaning. Now, that was a lot, and it's dismantling a lot of ideas about the way that language works. So we're going to look at a couple of objections here to why you might be concerned with the postmodernist case here. one might be concerned that such an argument lacks the payload that the postmodernist thinks that it does. One could claim that while in common parlance there are many different language games that we're playing when we're playing the truth language game, but when we're playing the truth language game, we're using a common set of rules. Sure, when I'm joking and I say something, I mean something different. When I'm watching a play and the actor says something, they mean something different. But when we're both agreeing that we're playing the truth language game, the language game that we're talking about things that are real right now, we're really using a common set of rules. When I say something, you know what I mean because that language game has sufficiently common set of rules that even minor nuances here or there aren't going to change the meaning of words. And our ability to communicate across disciplines demonstrates that we can create such a kind of common set of rules and communicate across cultures as well. If these language games are so different as the postmodernists might think us to believe, such that we could have completely different interpretations of texts based on completely different hierarchies of these dichotomies, then it seems that a lot of communication would be impossible. But in fact, we can communicate across cultures, and sometimes we need to call out underlying assumptions that happen, but we still seem to be able to communicate and get down to something that everyone agrees on is an objective meaning. Now, the postmodernists might respond that often disciplines do actually talk past each other, largely because they are using different language rules, which are all claimed to be oriented towards truth, but have importantly different kind of sets of rules. This concern around fragmentation of academic disciplines is going to show up again in a much bigger way when we look at Lyotard in the next video. So if you're curious about that, stay tuned for that video. Now, one might also think that the postmodernist argument is self-defeating. If Derrida is claiming that texts lack an objective interpretation, why should we interpret his text in that way as opposed to some other way? It seems concerning when, similar to the problems with kind of academic skepticism, that you would have a theory which would say that your own theories could be interpreted in a way such that your theory is meaningless. A response might be that things for the postmodernists are not so black and white. There may not be one right or one wrong interpretation of a text, but we might have stronger or weaker reasons for accepting one interpretation over another. We just need to understand that we will never have enough reasons to objectively determine that there is a right or wrong way to interpret a text. Though this weakens at least some of the force of the postmodernist critique, it's important to note that it still digs at that modernist notion that I can write a sentence down and you can go out into the world and find out if that sentence is true, regardless of your knowledge of kind of my background or what language games I'm playing, and without bringing into play any kind of language games of your own or any implicit assumptions that you have as well. What do you think? Do written words have objective meaning, or does their meaning depend on the language game that you are playing? Can you even know what an author truly meant in a text? Can you ever be certain that you're playing exactly the same language game as someone else by the same rules, and that when they say a phrase, you're interpreting that in the exact same way that they were interpreting it? And does that matter? Are our language games sufficiently different to cause this to be a worry for us? Or are our language games similar enough that these issues the postmodernist is bringing up actually aren't that serious? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video and you want to see more, please do hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can see the other videos we're posting. We still have a number of videos left in this series, so definitely do that. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.